Hello, boys and girls, and welcome back to Occult Overview, Episode 3. This was all in one big recording from the start of Episode 2 to being the end of this one, and that's because I'm a neurotic freak, and I tend to ramble on a lot about things that vaguely interest me. Then I also tend to go and a lot, so you add that up, and it's like probably 40 minutes of that, and then 20 minutes of actual solid conversation. But that being said, this will hopefully not be too disorganized. It touches on the question that we asked at the end of the last episode, which is why would a demonologist consider these kobolds, these knockers, these fey creatures? Why would he consider them to be demons? Because there is a doctrine in occultism. I say a doctrine. There's a thought. There's an idea that the Fae are demons. That is not something that would necessarily be exclusive to de Plancy, but there is that sense that if you're gonna have a demonologist say it, then you're gonna want some good reasoning for it. So with that in mind, we are pretty much gonna just pick up where we left off. So I hope you enjoy it. And if you have any comments, if you have any sources you want to share, then hey, give it a whirl and drop it in. We can go page by page with this, everybody. Page by page. So in Cornish folklore, because again, it starts out with the Welsh and the Cornish. A knocker is more specifically in Cornish and Devon folklore. Devon's like an adjacent county. And then the Welsh counterparts are very, very similar. And it's supposedly very close to the Irish leprechaun. I'm not too certain on that. I think it's close in the right. We'll get to it. I think it's close in the right places. But it's definitely closer to brownies. That's a more comparable thing to deal with. See, here's got the fun thing. The Cornish described the creature as a little person, 2 feet tall, with disproportionately large head, long arms, wrinkled skin, and white whiskers. It wears a tiny version of standard miner's garb and commits random mischief, such as stealing miners' unattended tools and food. So this is an angle as well, is that they've always been known for mischief. And that's not unlike a lot of sprites, so to speak. That's standard. So when we've looked at a lot of the sources which say they are exclusively helpful unless you disrespect them, that's not necessarily the case. And that's a whole topic of its own. So we can't dwell too much on that, because that's not the focus. But it's good to bear in mind that they aren't just entirely benevolent. And at the end of the day, a demonologist still, in his collection, called them the demons of mines. So that's interesting, and you should bear it in mind, because certainly I am as I go through this. You know, there's one book that I didn't get it in my local library, unfortunately. But it's a dictionary of Celtic mythology. It's by James McKillop. That's Mackillop. And he gives like solidly a good description of a knocker, like an interesting one. But in this as well, he presents like some of the theories as to like what they are. And one of the views, one of the surprisingly out there views is that these mine spirits are in fact the ghost of Jews who worked the mines in the 11th and 12th centuries. Now, I don't really believe that, but I think it's kind of cool. Because it makes sense that, like, yeah, if you're a disrespectful miner and a miner's already died down there, then maybe they want you to die too. Maybe they do. Maybe they're vengeful. Um, but if you're like a solid dude, they're like, oh man, I don't want to see this guy get boned. I'll help him out. I'll get him out of here when it gets dangerous. But we are again talking about danger. In terms of riches, I don't know if I was a miner, if I was a miner and I was a ghost, I'm not sure I'd be leading people to my riches. I'm not sure I would be. Um, Maybe that's thinking about it ironically a little bit too rationally. But I think the story doesn't align. But I think nonetheless it's interesting, and I haven't had a chance to read the full argument, so I would like to, but alas. Anyway, when we get to the I really don't know. The Coblynau, the Coblynau, Coblynau. I don't really know. But they are the mythical gnome-like creatures that are said to haunt mines and quarries of Wales. Yes, we're in the Welsh section. And this is what sort of led me on the path. So, Coblynau is related to the English word goblin and may derive from the Germanic source akin to the German kobold. And that goes via the French Goblin. So there's that. So there's obviously going to be something where it's like similar creatures, similar descriptions. Goblins are, they're categorized as being different, but they're similar. They are similar, and they get similar etymology and similar treatment in stories. When we move on to the kobolds, we're going back a little bit further now, and there's many famous kobolds, but they pretty much do the same thing. And they're also known. They have 3 different types. So there are those that are underground, and there are those that that do domestic chores, and then there are those that live aboard ships and help sailors. So the club man. but yeah, no. So we're getting into territory now where we start to see that these knockers are actually quite strongly linked culturally to goblins, which are known to hang out in your home and do evil shit to you, or otherwise just annoy you. And then kobolds, similarly, they have like that same angle, and they might help you on a ship, they might hinder you on a ship, they might help you in a home, hinder you in a home, help you in a mine, hinder you in a mine. So it all checks out. But why is that interesting? Well, it still goes back to I mentioned earlier. Remember Kobalos, a sprite from Greek mythology, a mischievous creature fond of tricking and frightening mortals. According to one myth, they robbed Heracles while he slept. He captured them in revenge, but he took pity on them when he found them amusing, which I find amusing as well. And in one version of the myth, he just handed them over as a gift. He's like, I tell you what, Queen Lydia, bam, there you go, take that. Take some goblins in a sack, which is very funny. And then, yeah, obviously parents use the tales of the Kobaloi to frighten children into behaving. And they are also decidedly similar to everything else that came after this. So, impudent, thieving, droll, idle, mischievous, gnome dwarves, and funny little tricksy elves. And at this point, they're not really shown to actually help you very much at all. They're funny, incompetent, and they're amusingly mischievous. But the interesting thing about them, when you really get down to like you go back to say kobolds and you have a look around and the way that they act and the way that they are sometimes worshipped is very, very similar to the guardian deities and household deities of Rome. So in ancient Roman religion, you would have these household deities, which everyone has like a little household altar, and it's just the god of your household. And when Christianity came to Rome, there was a big push to stop this because it's pagan, it's it's gross, and they decided, okay, enough of the household gods. We're gonna get rid of that, and you're only allowed Christian cults now, which is a funny little sentence, but it involved the same thing. You give offerings to them the same way that you would give offerings to knockers, goblins, kobolds, anything down that chain. You would give offerings to them so they would leave you alone or favor you. There's that level of especially when you think about the Romans and the Greeks, their deities are flippant. They are flippant things. They're as flippant as these kobolds. They're as flippant as these goblins. And suddenly that connection really intrigued me. Because that might perhaps be why de Plancy is interested in calling them demons. Because when you start to really chase it back to its source, these kobolds might have really been the household gods of the Romans. And that's interesting because that meant that they were most likely the household gods of the Etruscans. Etruscan civilization, we don't know too much of it comparatively. They preceded Rome. I think they were known as the people that built towers. I'm not sure if that's I'm pretty sure there was some translation which is it meant the people who build towers was their thing. So they were civilized. They were civilized in the eyes of Rome, at least in as close as you can get with Rome. Yes, we were talking about 900, 800 BC that they start to pop up. So that's a long time ago, and we do not need to go too deep on that one. You think about the 1800s, and then you think about 900, 800 BC, and suddenly it's oh yeah, okay, we're getting into it now. And you start to look at the genetic research of who the Etruscans were, largely just Italian, largely, there wasn't too much change, that they weren't really knocking about anywhere else, which was a little bit disappointing to figure out. But they do have some links to the Eurasian nomads, which is very, very interesting as well, because they kept domestic altars. Now, many civilizations throughout history held domestic altars. I'm not saying that this is the one through line and that's that, but you get to Scythian languages, you get to Scythian religion. It was in the Scythian or Scythian, I'm pretty sure Scythian, the Scythian city of Kamianka. And they had altars that were used for domestic cults, meaning obviously cults in the home. And it's uncertain whether they were connected to the cults of their major god or their major gods. But potentially they were these, what we would very much consider pagan deities within something we would already consider rather pagan. But that's extremely interesting to me, because when we start to look at, say, theology, the Romans are not depicted extremely kindly in the Bible. And that's largely because they were very, very unkind. They kept slaves. That's already pretty unkind. They kept slaves. They were an empire of war. They would extremely, almost very literally actually, violently decadent. So they're not portrayed extremely favorably, and that's perhaps for a very good reason. Their own historians portray themselves as largely terrible up to a certain point, and they don't even realize it sometimes. But that is the golden thread that we're talking about. That's why I think it's very interesting that a demonologist refers to the demons of minds, refers to then the knockers, which refers to the Coblynau, which refers to the goblin, the kobolds, and the Kobalos, and we get to the lares of Rome, the household gods, the Etruscans. You're going down and down and down. We get to 900, 800 BC, the Villanovan period, and we're getting to the Eurasian nomads, and it keeps going. We get to Scythia, it just keeps going. Which is why I now jump in from the future Not to end the video, don't worry. We've still got a little length to go. But to instead sort of summarize what we know so far. Because it is a confusing topic. And as I've previously said now, you just get deeper and deeper. And that's the case with a lot of occultism. You just dig further and further, and suddenly you don't know where you are. So let's just cut that off by its knees for a moment, and we'll stitch it back on, Frankenstein it together in a minute. Principally, you need to look at it as this. In fact, let's imagine, let's go through the ages. Imagine you're a Cornishman in a mine. You're eating your pasty, you're grumbling towards the fellow next to you, and you hear the knocking and you go, oh man, I'm getting paid a salary. That knocking means that there's going to be a collapse. Let's get out of here. And then you leave. Now, what do? You revere the thing that knocked. You revere these knockers. Which is a bit of a funny thing to say, but I mean the spirits, get your head out the gutter. But you revere these creatures for having warned you, and supposedly they occasionally take offense to people and they attack them. But generally they're quite nice as long as you're nice, you know? They might be mischievous occasionally. Occasionally, only occasionally. But at the end of the day, they like to lead you to riches and lead you from disaster. So, what could ever possibly be wrong with them? You give them offerings. You say very nice things about them to other people. You try and have people believe in them. You have people come and revere them to some degree. You have an entire mine of workers that is suddenly going to hopefully be, if not on edge, at peace and feeling at one with this creature. And then we're going to jump back a bit. But bear in mind for now, if you like ghost hunting shows, what's the one thing that is consistently brought up? Like, that spirits feed on energy and demons feed on energy. They like to scare you. They like to spook you, or they like to be worshipped, and they'd like you to pay attention to them. Okay, so just bear that in mind, because it's the same with most magical theory there is, which has an occult tradition. Energy and how you manifest that is extremely important. And emotion goes a long way towards that. And attention towards beings goes a long way towards that. But we go back a bit. Let's say that you can even be an ancient Greek sailor, and it would still be the same deal. That these creatures are aboard your ship. Now, hundreds of years in the future, someone's on that ship and they revere this creature that helps them tie some knots, helps them chase away some rats, gives them some food in return for like some nails for whatever reason. Any slight difference here is right. There's always a bargain, there's always an exchange. But you, as this ancient Greek, you're looking around and you go, well, actually, the sprites on this ship, they're little shits. They undo the rigging. They take nails from boards. They take your food. They fuck with you constantly. And that's interesting, right? That's interesting. Because, to a degree, you have to wonder in occultism, why are the Greeks not seen as demonic as perhaps the Romans are seen in occultism? Why aren't they under the same influence? And that's intriguing, and I think it has its merits to explore that, but it is a topic way too large for what we're talking about at the moment. But what you do know is that when the Greeks looked to the Romans, and suddenly we're in Rome town, and if when in Rome meant when to worship a demon and sacrifice your children, then you'd be basically in the spot you're supposed to be. Because these same creatures Just as they've acted aboard ships, just as they've acted aboard mines, they act within your home. Just as supposedly spirits might act in the home of a person in the modern day. Something over your shoulder, just waiting for you to give it some attention. And then it'll see what it can do with it. Out of the corner of the eye, out of the corner of a reflection. Something. But it needs something. So when you think of Rome, and you think of their household deities, you frame it from this Western occult tradition, which would generally frame these things as outside powers. Because a lot of occultism generally is centered around the organized religions of the region. So Islamic occultism is very different to Christian occultism. And I know more about Christian occultism, and I think generally all of us would know more about Christian occultism in the West because we have the traditions already there. It's a lot easier to know. You grow up with it to an extent. But that's why it's interesting to bear in mind, because it doesn't necessarily mean that... I mean, if you look at, say, the Freemasons and you look at ceremonial magic, that's going to potentially be a lot different, although we don't really know because they're Freemasons. But that's going to be quite a bit different from the Golden Dawn when it comes down to God. Because the Freemasons, they want you to believe in a God, right? The Freemasons don't care what higher power you believe in, as long as you believe in one higher power that's above all. That implies a degree of, well, it's perhaps all the same being, or perhaps it all has the same power, or perhaps all has the same influence, or perhaps it doesn't exist at all, or whatever. Either way, it doesn't change the circumstances. So it doesn't matter what name you call it, it will always deliver the same effect if you follow the ways of the Freemasons, which is another thing to bear in mind about them. Whereas you look at the Order of the Golden Dawn, and we're looking at some tetragrammaton sort of tap into God's name and become Jesus, become the Messiah sort of bullshit. It's suddenly, it's not about one higher power. It's about Crowley made his way up the ranks a little bit, supposedly got himself into a fun little ritual and decided, I'm going to take that and make my own thing now. He wanted to become very powerful. He tried to become very powerful. I think you can argue as to how powerful he became. But ultimately, the man was chasing Messiah. He was trying to be Jesus. And that's not in some cult of personality kind of way. That's not in terms of starting a religion kind of a way. I mean, literally, the magic that he was practicing was trying to propel him towards divinity. And we don't know whether the Freemasons practiced that. But what it serves to demonstrate is that Christian occultism, it is often still centered around God and godhood. And usually does come from Christian mysticism, which I'll see if I can do a video on at some point. But Christian mysticism is a whole thing of its own. So we won't worry about it too much at the moment. But use this perspective now of what you might consider Western occultism to be categorized as. See it from that Christian perspective. See it from the perspective of one God above all, no matter what. Whether he's a tyrant or whether he's a savior, you can deal with that yourself. And we'll do other videos that deal with that exact topic. But if you have these household deities that stray people away from God, then naturally they're going to be at odds. So if you take a specifically Christian perspective, then you see God as the good and his household deities as the evil. And a lot of fae spirits are seen as evil by organised religion. They carry no true sense of benevolence under those doctrines. And it's that kind of a doctrine in occultism that we're looking at. So we sort of define now that de Plancy probably calls these knockers, these kobolds, the Goblins, he calls them demons because within the tradition of Western occultism and Western religion altogether, they simply are. They simply are demonic. They might not be fallen angels. They might not be. That would be an even deeper dive into what precisely is going on there. But what they would be is certainly opposed to God. And anything that's opposed to God is going to naturally be a little bit more aligned to the demonic. It doesn't matter whether it's a case of being a minion. It doesn't matter if it's a case of being the big cheese conjuring MC. It doesn't matter. Either way, you're going to be positioned against God. And those that worship you and give you attention, that does feed you. It must feed you, right? Because in all theory that we possibly have, everyone agrees in that community, that culture. Everyone agrees that there is energy to be gained from interaction and energy to be gained from worship. So it sounds so silly, but these kobolds and these knockers, which eat pasties that are given to them because they knocked 3 times on a piece of wood to warn you about not dying. They were in fact, perhaps under this doctrine, the household gods of Rome, deities of the Etruscans, demons from Eurasia. And obviously you can argue whether that is something which travels as a culture or is true and underlying, which merely popped up in many places and then met in the centre to create the folklore that we have today. But that is perhaps a topic for another time, and perhaps a topic for an entirely different video. That said, I hope you feel as though we've answered the question. There's not much more to be said on it, and I think we can start now looking at other entries, and we can go into these other entries with an idea of how some Western occult tradition treats the Fae, and how it treats the idea of godhood, and how generally, as any person interested in the occult, we should treat history. We should treat it much like we treat the occult and we treat magic. We should treat that as changeable, and we should treat it in some sense as personal still. To bring up an old adage, history is written by victors. And if you can consider Christianity to have won in the West, or Islam to have won in the East, then you're going to have 2 occult traditions which try and figure out what really happened. Whether they're right, whether they're wrong, it's going to make for an interesting series, and hopefully an interesting entry on the next episode of Occult Overview. Thanks for watching. And have a great pasty eating day.